See, I do record it. Okay, hold on, there's no share screening. Okay, but 1 second, I'll just start this thing. Now, very high rate of what do you call it today, hey?
What, of COVID?
Terrible, 24,000, I think.
It's crazy. They're not opening the shuls for a while.
Got to bring light in other ways. Let me start this, come.
Okay.
Good work, everybody. Thank you so much for joining our webinar. Hearing a story on Motzei Shabbos. Zoiche to many good things. Please go through listening to Rabbi Carlebach this evening. We should be zoiche to the Izgalus of Mashiach, where there will be no more sickness, no more wars, no more pandemics. And I'm going to ask everybody listening, please share this with other people, because the Rebbe speaks about the importance of listening to a story of a tzaddik on Motzei Shabbos. We're going to hear many stories tonight. We will finish at 8:15. Have a good vach. Thank you, Rabbi Carlebach.
Thank you, Rabbi Masinta. Good vach to everybody. As you know, today we blessed the month of Av. It was Shabbos Mevorchim Av, and that means next Shabbos is Shabbos Rosh Chodesh. It is the month, it's Rosh Chodesh of next Shabbos, and just by the way, Tisha B'Av then is in 2 weeks, Motzei Shabbos and Sunday. So the beginning of the 9 days begins next Saturday night, when all the different customs come into place. And tonight we'd like to perhaps dedicate the shir to a wonderful couple whose son is here, the Ainsworths, who are missing in Surfside, together with all the many people who are missing there. May Hashem be with them. Tonight, as Rabbi Masinta mentioned, I would like to tell a few stories. One of them is told by somebody who I grew up with in many ways. His name is Rabbi Yaacov Biderman, and he is the Shliach in Austria. And he tells this story about his relationship in a way with the Rebbe and the famous Viktor Frankel. Viktor Frankel is the founder of Logotherapy. He wrote his book on telling us that the most important thing in life is to find meaning. So here's the story. Rabbi Yaacov Biderman tells, I arrived in Vienna together with my wife Edla in 1981 to be the Shluchim in Austria. We started serving the local Jewish community. We arranged Torah classes, programs, etc. We are aware that the famous Dr. Viktor Frankel resided in Vienna, but as he never associated with the Jewish community, we didn't have the opportunity to make his acquaintance. He certainly never stepped foot in the Chabad center we established. And yet we were extremely surprised. We print a Jewish calendar in honor of Rosh Hashanah. We send it out to all the local Jews and asking for contribution in our annual appeal. And Dr. Viktor Frankel actually sent a check to us. He continued his practice every year thereafter. And yet I never met him. I never spoke to him. His donation always came. We didn't understand this whole story until one day in 1995, it became clear. It started with a visit from a youthful, energetic 85-year-old woman who introduced herself as Marguerite. Perhaps you think you are the first emissary of the Lubavitcher Rebbe to Vienna, but that's not entirely the case. You see, she said, I personally performed an important mission here on the Rebbe's behalf long before you arrived in Austria. She told us her mother's maiden name was Hagar. The Hagars were no ordinary Jewish family, but relatives to the Rebbes of the famous Vishnitzer Hasidim. By the way, Elie Wiesel was a famous Vishnitzer Chassid. Marguerite was born in Czernowitz, but spent her childhood in Vienna. Marguerite became an opera singer. She married and had a daughter. Just a few days before Second World War, friends helped her escape together with her husband and daughter across the border to Italy. They made it onto the last boat to the United States. Marguerite and her family settled in Detroit. Unfortunately, the rest of her family remained behind, and they all perished in the Holocaust. Years passed. Marguerite's daughter grew up and married a doctor. In 1959, she was honored at the dinner of a Chabad institution. And because of that, Marguerite had a yechidus, a personal audience with our beloved Rebbe. Marguerite says, I cannot explain why, but while in the Rebbe's room, I suddenly broke down in tears. I felt that here it was fine to cry. The dam holding back my river of tears gave way. Like many Holocaust survivors in those days, I had never cried before. Because if I were to start crying, I felt I might never, ever stop. I always felt that I had to keep my emotions in check in order to be able to function as a human being. And yet at that yechidus, I cried. Marguerite told the Rebbe her entire life story. But more than that, a special relationship was born that night in the Rebbe's room in Brooklyn. Marguerite left that audience feeling that she had been given to a second father. Marguerite also mentioned to the Rebbe that for some time now, she had a yearning to go back and visit her native land. The Rebbe requested that in the event she would make such a trip, please, the Rebbe said, come see me beforehand. Not long after that, Marguerite scheduled a trip to Vienna. And of course, she first came to the Rebbe to inform her of her plan. How surprised Marguerite was when the Rebbe asked her if she could do him a favor. The Rebbe wanted her to visit two people on his behalf. One of them was Dr. Viktor Frankel, who headed the Vienna Polyclinic of Neurology. Please send Dr. Frankel my personal regards and pass the following message on to him, that I said that he should be strong and continue his work with complete resolve. No matter what, he must never give up. If he remains strong and committed, he will certainly prevail. That was the message the Lubavitcher Rebbe sent to Dr. Viktor Frankel. Arranging a meeting with Frankel was no simple task. Arriving at the clinic, she was told that the professor hadn't shown up in 2 weeks. With effort, though, Marguerite found Frankel's home address and made her way there. Marguerite knocked on the door. It was opened by a woman. The first thing that caught her eyes was a cross hanging prominently on the wall. You see, in 1947, Frankl married his second wife, Eleanor Katharina Schwind, a devout Catholic. Taken aback by the cross and wondering whether this was a mistake, if perhaps she has the wrong home that the Rebbe had wanted her to visit, she nevertheless asked whether there was a Herr Professor Frankel in the house. Marguerite was asked to wait. A few moments later, a slightly annoyed-looking and apparently uninterested Dr. Frankel appeared. Marguerite, feeling very self-conscious, told him, "I have regards for you from Rabbi Schneerson of Brooklyn, New York." Marguerite steeled herself and continued. "Rabbi Schneerson, known as the Lubavitcher Rebbe, sent a message to you. And he said, remain strong, continue your work with complete resolve. Don't give up. Ultimately, you will prevail." The hitherto apathetic doctor suddenly transformed before a shocked Marguerite's eyes. Tears befilled his eyes. After composing himself somewhat, he thanked Marguerite. In the course of the ensuing conversation, he told her that he had been planning to abandon his efforts to fight on behalf of his theory and philosophy, and was actually considering leaving Vienna completely. But now that he received the message from the Rebbe, he would reconsider. Marguerite concluded, "So you see, Rabbi Biderman, now you understand what I meant when I served as the Rebbe's emissary to Vienna way before you arrived." Marguerite's story, says Rabbi Biderman, fascinated me. What had the Rebbe's message meant to Viktor Frankel? Why did it touch him so deeply? Says Rabbi Biderman, what I didn't know beforehand, but what Marguerite now explained, is that Viktor Frankel wasn't always lauded and respected as he is today. In his youth, Viktor Frankel had been a young colleague of Sigmund Freud and Alfred Adler. His beliefs challenged their teachings, whereas the dominant view at the time was that people are driven by the need to gratify physical needs, a will for pleasure, he saw humankind differently. In Frankel's view, we are unique beings, different to any other physical beings, because we are driven by a will for meaning, possessing free choice and the capacity for self-transcendence. Between stimulus and response is our power to choose our response. And it is in our response that our growth and our freedom lie. Frankel began to develop these radical ideas before the war. And during his time in the Nazi death camps, seeing how some prisoners were able to eke out a sense of purpose and maintain a positive outlook, even in Auschwitz and other places, he solidified that concept that the will to meaning is the most important. But when he taught that, he found himself a lone dissenter. All around him were loyal Freudian scholars, and he was taunted. His lectures were shunned. Understandably, Viktor Frankl experienced incredible emotional turmoil. The pressures were so great, he decided to give it all up. In fact, he decided at the time that he is going to move to Australia to join his sister who lived there. He was emotionally spent and dejected at the prospect of his life's work going to waste. When Marguerite arrived at Frankel's home, she told Rabbi Biderman he was sitting at that time drafting his immigration papers. And she brought him a message from a Rebbe, a young Hasidic master from overseas that he'd never heard of before, who said from the Rebbe, don't give up, you will prevail. Frankel was beyond astonished. How in the world did the Rebbe in New York know about my situation in Vienna? And why would this Hasidic Rebbe care about him or the perpetuation of his philosophy? And yet, it was exactly the shot in the arm that Viktor Frankel needed. And the timing could not have been better. Instead of joining his sister in Australia, he was given new hope. He continued his practice as a psychiatrist, went back to his work, full of renewed motivation, vigor, and optimism. I now understood. Marguerite's story certainly helped explain why Viktor Frankel would send an annual contribution to support the Rebbe's institutions in Vienna. And hearing this story stirred me to contact Dr. Viktor Frankel himself, thinking perhaps he'd have something to add. A few days later, I called Frankel and asked to meet him. It was very difficult to meet him in person. This was 1995. You must understand that Viktor Frankel at the time was 90 years of age. We spoke over the phone. I said, do you remember Marguerite Chayes? Naturally, he did. She had become a friend of the family. Throughout this short conversation, however, Viktor Frankel sounded impatient. I said, do you remember a regard she gave you from Rabbi Schneerson in Brooklyn? A change in his demeanor. Now, suddenly, Viktor Frankel responded warmly. Of course. How can I ever forget it? The Rebbe came to my aid during a very difficult time in my life. I owe him a tremendous debt of gratitude. What indeed was the result of Marguerite's mission? Well, it was soon after their meeting in 1959 that Frankel's book, first book, Man's Search for Meaning, was translated into English. At first, by the way, it was translated under a different title. It became a bestseller, a classic psychiatric text, and propelled him into the international limelight. Frankel became a guest lecturer at universities on 5 continents. He received honorary doctorates from universities around the world, national and international awards and medals for his pivotal work in psychotherapy. Before his death in 1997, his magnum opus had been translated into dozens of languages and sold millions of copies. His brand of therapy inspired thousands of other books, seminars, workshops, New Age and spiritual groups, all based on Frankel's idea that the human being's unique ability to make choices and pursue his own meaning. From Scott Peck's Road Less Traveled to Stephen Covey's 7 Habits and hundreds of other bestsellers during the last 30 years. All are variations of Viktor Frankel's perspective. And so many millions of people, directly or indirectly, from the Rebbe's communique to Dr. Frankel. I sometimes shudder, says Rabbi Biderman, when I imagine what could have occurred, what would have occurred, if not for that perfectly timed message. And yet, the story does not end. Halden Klingberg, author of When Life Calls Out to Us, the love and life work of Viktor and Ellie Frankel, the only authorized biography of Viktor and Eleanor, writes the following. After his death, I asked Ellie if he actually made these prayers every day. Absolutely. He never missed a day. Every morning for more than 50 years, he davened, but no one else knew this. They traveled the globe, and Viktor Frankel took his tefillin every place with him. Everywhere, every morning, he prayed. He utterly memorized the words of our davening and Tefillin. Rabbi Biderman says, after Viktor Frankel passed away, I saw his tefillin for the first time. Ellie had placed them in the little cubicle with his simple possessions. Indeed, Frankel's non-Jewish son-in-law confirmed this fact to me. He said, my father-in-law would close himself off in a room every day for a little while. Once I opened the door and saw him with black boxes on his head and hand. He was annoyed about my intruding on his privacy. When he was taken to the hospital, however, his practice of putting on tefillin became public. Rabbi Biderman says, I've often wondered, why did the Rebbe take such an interest in the success of Viktor Frankel, a secular and intermarried Jew, and sought him out to offer encouragement and support? It would seem that the Rebbe did this not only out of personal concern for Frankel's welfare, but also in order to advance a philosophy which he felt ultimately fosters belief in God, a spiritual perspective, and good values. The fact that this constitutes the real cure to a suffering soul is something that the Rebbe repeatedly taught us. And he concludes by saying, I cannot help but marvel over the Rebbe's wide reach, broad-mindedness, and remarkably visionary approach. That is one story of the Rebbe and Tefillin. I would like to now tell a second story about the Rebbe and Tefillin. I remember this person, but those in South Africa may not. So here is the story. October 6th, 1965 was the first game of the 65 World Series, the baseball game. It was the Los Angeles Dodgers versus the Minnesota Twins. Yom Kippur night at Metropolitan Stadium. 47,797 people were in attendance at that stadium. Sandy Koufax, who was the lead pitcher of the LA Dodgers, refused to play the game. Sandy Koufax's refusal to pitch on Yom Kippur gained him the respect and admiration of many Jews. 1965, Judaism in America wasn't as publicized as it was today, thanks to the Rebbe. And yet, his courage gave many Jews the strength to not be ashamed of their Judaism. The day after Yom Kippur, Sandy Koufax received a visit in his St. Paul hotel room from Rabbi Moshe Feller. He was the regional director of Merkaz Li'Onyonei Chinuch, and he was the Rebbe's Shliach in the Twin Cities, Minnesota and St. Paul. Moshe Feller congratulated Koufax for not playing on Yom Kippur and for the great assist he gave rabbis and Jewish educators the world over. Rabbi Feller also brought Sandy Koufax a pair of tefillin. And this is what he told the pitcher. Since you bat with your right hand and you throw with your left hand, I wasn't sure what type of tefillin to get you. Do I get you the right-handed tefillin, which right-handed people put on their left arm, or do I get you the lefties that put on the right arm? But considering what your left arm has accomplished, after all, he was a world-class pitcher, I decided to get you the type that you put on your right arm. Sandy Koufax accepted the gift, thanked Rabbi Feller for visiting. Rabbi Feller later explained the Talmud says that tefillin is representative of all the mitzvahs of the Torah. So I couldn't think of a better way to honor a person for enhancing Jewish values than presenting him with a pair of tefillin. 2 weeks later, at a Simchas Torah Farbrengen, our Rebbe spoke about the Jewish pitcher who refused to play on Yom Kippur. And this is paraphrasing the Rebbe's Sikha. He said the first condition in influencing a child is that the child must see a living example by his parents. If a child sees his parents studying Torah at a time when the parents would otherwise be involved in business dealings, thereby surrendering a few dollars of profit and perhaps causing that he won't be written up in the newspapers as one of the top dealers, this is an example of self-sacrifice for the child. Or, said the Rebbe, when a parent gives up a half hour of watching TV, reading the newspaper, discussing politics, even though he thinks that he knows what President Johnson ought to do. And if President Johnson would ask this Yidel what to do, he would tell him to do it this way. When he renounces all of this, and he doesn't even know what the World Series is, that becomes an example for your child. The Rebbe included those who don't know what the World Series is, good for them. In fact, I wish I didn't know. But then the Rebbe said, there's a young man who has a beard who went to see the pitcher that wouldn't pitch on Yom Kippur. And he told him that he doesn't play baseball on Rosh Hashanah either. The young man told the pitcher he would give him a present. He gave him a pair of tefillin. The pitcher told him he still remembers tefillin. However, he didn't want to put them on at that time. The young man left, and that day the pitcher lost the game. But at the end, it turned out he won the World Series. On his table, there were the Tefillin. In the end, even a distant individual will not be distant, and he will have the merit to put them on. And another Jew will be added to those who have donned Tefillin. I would like to now go to a total different tact. And this is a very fascinating story that happened in Tsarist Russia. In those days, everybody was drafted into the Tsarist army. It was a very great danger to your life. And Hasidim, especially of the Rebbe Rashab, would often come to him and ask for brachas that they shouldn't be drafted in. So there was a Rabbi Peretz Chaim who received a letter saying that he had to show up at the conscription office. There, a government-certified physician would appraise the young man's health before determining whether he was fit for grueling army service. The letter told him he has to report to the conscription office in Hummel, a large administrative center in what was then White Russia. Now, the Tsar's army was no place for a Jew who wished to follow Jewish tradition or even remain alive. Everybody knew that Jewish conscripts were treated worse than their fellow soldiers, and they were the first to be sent to the front, ill-prepared for the rigors of battle. And obviously, he wouldn't be able to keep kosher or anything like that. In addition, he was needed at home, where he worked hard to support his parents and siblings. Peretz Chaim was very worried. He knew that there was only one man who could help him. He traveled to Lubavitcher to meet with the fifth Lubavitcher Rebbe, Rabbi Sholem Dov Ber Schneerson, also known as the Rebbe Rashab. The Rebbe Rashab dispelled any worries. He said, with God's help, you will never be a soldier. Just do what you're told, report to the office in Hummel. Everything will be okay. Tracht gut wird sein gut. Now, there were many different places one could go to. Hummel was known to be the most severe, more than the staff in the other intake centers around the country. The Rebbe's advice did not sit well with some of Reb Peretz Chaim's relatives. Fearing the worst, they said, please, what does the Rebbe know? Don't go to Hummel. That is the worst place. Go anywhere else. But their doubts and bleak predictions couldn't sway young Peretz. He remained confident in his Rebbe's words. And so he departed for Hummel, determined to fulfill the Rebbe's directives. He arrived there long before his scheduled appointment, which was going to take place on Shabbos. Knowing that he would be in town for several days, he arranged to lodge with a local Jew, a Polish chassid. Shabbos morning was nerve-wracking, as could be for a Peretz. He wanted to pray alone, have a quick Shabbos meal, get it over with. Run to the conscription office to make sure that he's there on time. We don't want to get them angry. His host gently detained him. He said, what are you worried about? You have the Rebbe's bracha. There's no reason to hurry. let's go to shul, as Jews were able to do in those days. There was no COVID. And after the Shabbos meal, which we'll eat together, I'll go with you to the conscription office. Against his better judgment, Rebbe Peretz listened to his host. They prayed together, spent most of the Shabbos afternoon singing traditional zmiras over a lavish meal. The host did everything slowly and deliberately, as though he had all the time in the world. Rebbe Peretz Chaim sat in a seat, a tight ball of nerves, thinking continuously at the appointment he was going to miss. When they finally arrived at the conscription office, it was very late in the day. The employees were about to head home after having seen a day's worth of draft-eligible men. "Why did you show up now?" The exasperated employees yelled at him, but they knew that the office hours were still on, and they had no choice but to evaluate him. They wanted to get home. They conferred, apparently trying to find out how to rid themselves of this newcomer so they could go home already. At last, they decided to give him a white card, certifying him as so clearly unfit that there was no need for further inspiration. After informing him that he was released, they told Rebbe Peretz to come back in a few days to pick up the appropriate documents. Peretz and his host were free to celebrate the remainder of Shabbos with gladness and with joy. And the rest of his family appreciated how listening to the Rebbe is always the right thing to do. Our final story for this Motzei Shabbos is a very interesting and perhaps sad one, certainly connected to our times. For many years, Reb Ze'ev Kitzes, who was one of the holy Rabbi Yisrael Baal Shem Tov's senior Hasidim, wanted to travel to the Holy Land. The long-awaited opportunity arrived. Reb Ze'ev stood in the Baal Shem Tov's rooms to receive his Rebbe's bracha for a safe journey. The Baal Shem Tov's parting words to him were, "Remember, Reb Ze'ev, one must know how to properly answer a question. Weigh your words carefully before you speak." Reb Ze'ev had no idea what his Rebbe meant with these words, but he kept them near to his heart, certain that with their relevance would be revealed to him before long. To get to the sea was quite a journey, but Baruch Hashem, he arrived there without incident. He boarded the ship that was to take him to the Holy Land. At one of the ports of call along the way, a mishap occurred. The ship stopped to take on supplies. The passengers disembarked to spend a few hours on solid ground. They were told, "You can all go off, but remember, listen for the call. There'll be a horn, and when you hear that call, you come back to the ship." Reb Ze'ev was deeply immersed in his thoughts, in his learning, in his davening, and he didn't hear the call to reboard the ship. He was left behind. In growing distress, Reb Ze'ev wandered about this strange place. He had no idea where he was. He seemed to be on some sort of island. He didn't know how long he would have to wait there for another ship. And suddenly, he heard a kindly voice ask, Rabbi, why do you look so crestfallen? Lifting his eyes, he found himself looking into a saintly face with luminous features, a snow-white beard. His joy and relief knew no bounds. Yes, there was a Jewish community on the island, fully equipped with a shul, a mikveh, and not to worry, there would be another ship in a few days. In the meantime, the old man would be deeply honored to have this esteemed visitor, a disciple of the holy Baal Shem Tov, no less, as his guest for Shabbos. Reb Ze'ev's host turned to be a veritable Torah scholar, and the two spent Shabbos in prayer and in davening. Reb Ze'ev felt as if he was back in Mezhebush at his Rebbe's table. On Sunday morning, Reb Ze'ev, accompanied by his attentive host, returned to the harbor to meet a ship that had stopped at the island. In parting, the old man said, "Tell me, Reb Ze'ev, be honest, how is it with the Jews of your country? How are our Jews faring in Golus, in exile?" Reb Ze'ev said, "Baruch Hashem, everything is good. The Almighty does not forsake his people." The ship was well on its way out of the harbor when Reb Ze'ev suddenly remembered what the Baal Shem Tov had said to him on the eve of his journey. He said, "Woe is me. What have I done? Didn't the Rebbe warn me to consider my words carefully before I answer? Why didn't I tell this man the truth? Why didn't I tell him the poverty, the persecutions, the suffering that our people go through, the daily struggle to persevere in the face of those who want to destroy us, body and soul?" Reb Ze'ev was so devastated by his failure to carry out the Baal Shem Tov's instructions. For now, he was in no doubt that it was this encounter with the old man on the island that his Rebbe had in mind. At the next port, he got off the ship. He traveled back to Mezhebush to tell his Rebbe, the holy Baal Shem Tov, what happened. Reb Ze'ev said to Baal Shem Tov sadly, "Every single day, Avram Avinu, our father Abraham, the first Jew, confronts the Almighty and he says, 'Master of the universe, what will become of my children? Why are they still in Golus?' And the rabbi says, and Hashem says, 'I do not forsake him.' But Avram Avinu is not appeased. God said to him, 'Why don't you ask them yourself? Look, there goes Reb Ze'ev Kitzis, an honest and upright Jew on his way to the Holy Land. Why don't you ask him?' Said the Baal Shem Tov, 'If you would have only told Avram Avinu the truth, that we cannot bear this Golus anymore. We cannot take it. We need redemption. We need Mashiach now,' we would have had him. Chevra, whatever our circumstances are, let's cry out at Motzei. Let's cry out, we need Mashiach now. We cannot carry on in this Golus, in the prayer and the hope that finally Avram Avinu will accomplish his mission and Hashem will bring about the righteous Redeemer, Mashiach now, then Tisha B'Av will be transformed into a day of holiday. We won't have to mourn anymore. Thank you, a good fach.
Rabbi Carlebach, you were power this evening. Thank you very much. And please God, b'schus this, we should all have the Izgalus Mashiach. Take care for miyad mamish.
Thank you, a good fach.